Hi, everyone, and welcome to this year's Open Source Data Summit. I'm Eric Gonzalez, and I'm joined today by two phenomenal panelists to discuss something that has been a hot topic for a number of years in the data world, but has really become prevalent with the rise and popularity of AI today, which is the different perspectives on batch, streaming, and real-time data processing. But before we get into today's session, I want to turn it over to our two panelists. Mike, if you want to give a brief introduction.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here. I'm Mike. I'm one of the co-founders and I'm the CEO at Tecton. At Tecton, we make infrastructure to make it really easy for folks to build machine learning with batch streaming and real-time data and run it in production as a reliable software service. So very relevant topic for me.
Awesome. And Vaishnavi?
Yes, so my name is Vaishnavi and I'm working as a data engineer at Intuit. And we are currently handling one of the Intuit acquired products called Time. So where I'm leading the initiative for the data engineering on that product side. Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you guys for the introductions. So let's dive right into it. And I think something that people discuss with batch and real time and streaming is there's some blurred lines between them, or maybe people don't have the right definition. They conflate some of them together. And so when you think about those three concepts, Mike, how do you address, or what do you feel is the most common misconception about each of them?
Well, there's the kind of like understanding of what they are, and then the kind of like boundary between them and when to use one and when to use the other. And we help people do machine learning. Like if you're doing real-time machine learning, the platform we built Tecton is kind of like one of the main things that you might use. And so we deal with a lot of these scenarios where someone has fast data and they're like, how do I got my Eng team. We got like user interactions, or users are using our app quickly. And it's not often the case where they're like ahead of time, they're like, I need to do streaming data. It's more like there's some data in our product, the customer's interacting with us, the user's pressing these buttons, or we connect to some external service. How should we build this thing? Like, what's the right way to like set it up? And so it's kind of like there's these three scenarios. There's these three options that you might use, right? Batch, which we think of as kind of if you're running some job that is not operating on a per data basis or per event basis. So, you run, this is like probably what you deal with a lot as kind of you run the BI team, right? Like there's a lot of, hey, let's run a SQL query every night and kind of get all the data processed, right? Or every week or whatever it is. And then there's streaming compute. And so in the machine learning, the AI world, we talk about features. So the data becomes features that are inputs to ML models. And those are things where you want to compute, you want to update your values after every single event happens. So imagine you want a feature that represents, hey, how many times has this person made a purchase on our platform? Well, you want to update that every single time you can't wait till like midnight, and then you're going to be out of date until midnight, right? And then real time is compute that happens when the request happens for the read. So, and the use cases that we deal a lot with in the AI world, someone is logging in, let's say, and we want to detect, is this fraud or not? Well, we need all of that data. It doesn't matter if it's batch, streaming, or real time, wherever it comes from, but we need to get all of that data right now so we can make a prediction really quickly. And sometimes that data cannot be computed ahead of time, or it's not efficient to be computed ahead of time. As an example, imagine it's a search thing and someone's entering in a query. You need to featureize, you want to do some operations on that query to kind of decompose it in some way to extract its meaning. There's no way you could compute that ahead of time. That's not an option. So those types of features are what we call real-time features, real-time data. And so the biggest area of confusion tends to be between streaming and real-time. There's a couple of reasons why folks get confused, because the batch one's kind of obvious. I run a SQL query every night kind of thing, and you can start running it faster and faster, and you can kind of like approximate streaming at some point. But the real confusion is like, when should I use streaming versus when should I use real-time compute? And like the big distinction in those compute models is Streaming compute happens when the event happens. So, someone makes a purchase. Now I got to update my count of how many purchases this user has made. Whereas the real-time compute happens when I'm trying to read all of this information so I can say make a prediction, right? So I might say, okay, I'm trying to make a prediction now. Now let me go add up all of those transactions. And there's different kind of types of features, different types of compute that are more relevant for one or the other. And a big kind of detail that or dimension that tends to be a confusing domain here is the concept of like latency or like data freshness versus serving latency. So we talk about how fast is it, right? Streaming is fast, real time is fast, but there's two components there. It's how fast from when the data happens, when the event happens, is the compute updated? So, someone makes a transaction, how fast till account is updated? And then the second one is how fast is it to serve this data? How fast when I want to read this data, do I get it in 5 milliseconds or do I have to wait, 2 seconds kind of thing? And so those are two kind of like parallel components that confuse people along the way. And, both streaming and real time tend to be optimized for freshness, for event to computed value latency, but real-time compute is tends to be way higher optimized for that and way higher optimized for like working with a real-time serving system. It tends to operate after the real-time serving system. So that's how we think about it, and it's kind of like a complicated thing. So you kind of want to have some systems that help you kind of make sense of all of this and make it easy to develop all these because they tend to use different technologies under the hood.
Yeah. And the other component that you talked about, which I will want to lean in on later in the conversation, is the ability to serve that data or having those different architectures for the different operations that your company or your client or whoever you're working with is using. Because if you invest in having a streaming architecture, you invest in having a real-time architecture, obviously in cases of fraud or certain disease detection where time is of the essence, you need those things in place. But if the operations team, if the fraud team, if the doctor, if whoever is taking that data is not operating off of it in a real-time fashion, then that's meaningless. And you can have a day lag if the operations are going to lag a day anyways. And so but before we get to that, Vaishnavi, is there any other misconception that you hear or that you see at Intuit or along your career between these different types of architecture?
The marketing team requirements keeps on changing. The attributes that they generally expect, right? It keeps on changing because even they are experimenting a lot. They're trying to change, the requirements then and there, like within a very short while. Before the way we come and, just try to give them the attributes, we have a complete list of new requirements. And so there is that little mismatch in, like whatever goals or the requirements that was set before and what was set on the go, because that little clarity is missing, because still all the teams are maturing to understand and what exact insights that we can get and how that can even indirectly tie back to the revenue as well, right? So due to this one, we always used to have, like, due to that lack of clarity and all, we always used to rework on like lot of things, and finally things are getting de-scoped on something which we have spent quarters of the time over that. Yeah.
Yeah, I almost think, Mike, it's a little bit of both of your questions of what you're asking. Like, it is changing requirements, but sometimes people are biting off more than they can chew or trying to take on something that is larger than what they anticipated for because they just want to jump into that new tech or they want to jump into the most fresh and best data that they can have available for them at that time, rather than really understanding where they're at or if it's the right decision for their business. And so that brings me into my next question, which is, when I'm speaking with different teams or speaking with potential clients about which of these might be right for my business, should I invest in or spend more money on developing a streaming or real-time architecture? Should I just stick with the batch processing that I have? It's really trying to interview them and understand, to Vaishnavi's point, what are those requirements? How can we make sure that we align on scope and ensure that we can at least ship out an MVP so that you can start unlocking value from this data before we, buy the shiniest new object possible. So Vaishnavi, with your experience and just to continue on what you're talking about, how do you address these questions and how do you try to flesh out the true requirements versus the wanted requirements?
Okay, so I think all this comes down how, like how the customers are trying to adapt to the new changes that were happening around, right? It's not just like, we have something in our mind and we wanted to implement, but it's like we see the shift in customers' usage of the product. So now when they, the AI, has come over, like it's taking over every product out there. So the business and even the management wants to see how we can plug in the AI into this and how we can shift the experience of the customers of the product. So that's how, like, it all always tries to comes down to the product level, how customers are using it, how customers shifting to the pattern of using the products in a different way. So based on that, that actually rolls back to what developers have to actually, try to bring in. Because at the end of the day, we want to have more customers to use our product and want to get benefited from our product. So the same case comes for even batch and also the real time. So previously, right, so most of our pipelines were used to be in the batch, because we used to see maybe weekly once we'll just send them a notification or like a mail, like these were the things they have done, and these are the next set of things they can do to set up their accounts, or just see their dashboards. But now most of the users wants things in real time, just within seconds. They just wanted to open their account and they just wanted to see, like, maybe when it comes to one of our product like QuickBooks, right, they wanted to see their revenue, they wanted to see how much, the cost that they have had in the past week, and they wanted to see where most of the money was going in, like operations and all. So now people's customers pattern is getting shifted. Now they want most of the things in real time. Nowhere they wanted to wait for like a couple of days and see, okay, this is how it's happening. So due to the shift in their pattern, right, that's the reason we are also getting more initiatives to move most of our pipelines into the streaming or the real time phase, because that's where we feel most of the customers need is existing in. So that's how always, like the business requirements comes back to us based on the major shift it is happening, and also definitely some small POCs or A to B testing that happens in the products. And once they find, okay, this feature is really working out, let's try to see whether we can get this data in real time so that users can get benefited out of it. So it always comes back, to the core product level and how, customers are trying to adapt to it, so that we have to fall in back in place to ensure, we serve them the best way.
And that's a perfect segue, because I actually wanted to delve into more of that product mindset and think about the decision-making criteria with you, Mike, because I know before founding and leading Tecton, you worked in product at Google and you worked in product at Uber. And so as you built your career through that product lens around this, and I'm sure gave you a lot of learning lessons to what you do today, what were some of those things that you learned in big tech that helped you understand that decision-making criteria from a product lens into what you're doing today at Tecton?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the way to think about this is, it's kind of like what Vaishnavi said, where you got to understand what the business needs, and so the business needs come from what your product is and how people interact with your product and stuff like that. And you really kind of need the right. So let's talk about, like, without being a data expert, how do you think about this? Well, you need to hire a data expert. You're not going to figure this out on your own. You hire a data expert, say an architect or like someone like you, like a VP of data, and then you kind of like the quality of your hire will affect obviously how good of a strategy you take. So like a bad hire would just think would do something like the scenario that Vaishnavi was just talking about, like someone who's just like gets enamored by the technology and wants to do the most complicated thing for everything, right? Oh, let's do everything real time. Well, the business doesn't need that most of the time. It doesn't need everything to be in real time. And so everything is going to be real time eventually, but the kind of like core strategy is how do you kind of like map your investments to the business's needs to enable the right level of innovation and keep the business successful without spending too much money. So a really bad hire there will just not spend, will invest too much too early, and ultimately these projects fail if you kind of like, how many times do you see a company who's like, we're trying to do everything real time, and then they kind of don't really know how to execute on it, and they don't have people who know how to do it, and they don't need it, and it kind of fails. So a next quality tier hire would say, hey, we don't need that. We just really all our business needs is just like batch, right? If that's true, like the business today, whatever the business needs today, we're not doing anything real time. Let's just stick with batch. It's easier. It's easier to maintain. It's easier. It's cheaper. It's easier for us to get the right people to do it, and we can be more reliable and stuff like that. The problem there is like that's a little bit of a kind of not a forward-looking approach, because you want to be keeping an eye on where you need to go and ensure that you're staying competitive. So imagine, you're an insurance company and your competitor launches like real-time quoting or something like that. Well, if you're not ready for that, then you're kind of 3 years away from having real-time quoting being possible in your business. So a really good hire here is someone who understands kind of like what's the needs for the business today, but also understands where do we need to go in the future, and can be and can use good judgment in investing and making those investments into kind of innovation in the data stack. And so what we see is that there's typically a handful of use cases that are really the ones. It's rare that like every single thing you need to do with data is real time. It's typically like, one use case is the one thing that needs real time. For example, fraud detection needs to be fast, but all of our BI can be slow or something like that, which is fine. And so then there's kind of like a little bit of a strategy for, well, how do we kind of dip our toes into this and invest enough that we're confident we can be successful? We give it a real shot at being successful without kind of over investing and compromising our ability to execute on everything else in the business. So that's the kind of like real strategy that someone has to think through. And it often involves, starting within a team rather than kind of rolling it out company wide, like, hey, now we have real-time data for everybody. Could just be like on the fraud team, we built a couple of real-time things. And this is actually a lot of the stuff that Tecton's brought in for is, hey, the business is not enabled for real-time yet, but we have this really important AI use case where we want to make fast decisions and be flexible and reactive to the world and have amazing user experience. And so let's bring in the right tools to enable real-time AI here, and we'll get a win there. And then we'll kind of expand from there. And often you want to optimize not for the most valuable use case, but for the fastest win. So you can kind of like start getting repeatability, and you establish like a pattern of success that you can kind of copy paste to other teams. So I think that's kind of like a lot of how I would think about kind of rolling this out. There's one important thing additionally to think about, which is just like, is the use cases like is your business fundamentally fast or not? Because it's just a little bit thinking a little bit deeper about the competitive landscape. You may not need real time today, but if all of your competitors, if the kind of like core experience is one where it makes sense for your customers to get a faster experience, you can bet that your customers or your competitors rather, or some startup is working on a real-time version of whatever your offering is. And so depending on where you want to be placed in the market, do you want to be seen as a leader or a laggard? And that's a fine strategy for many people. That's like a really informative input to that data architect or data VP's strategy.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that was spot on. I want to lean into what you're talking about of like the different types of data hires or the different types of people that would come in. From my experience, a average or okay person will come in and ask like, what do you need me to do? The above average person will come in and say, how do you want me to do this? And the prime excellent hire will say, why are we doing this? And so trying to have that person who comes in and questions and prioritizes based off of those questions is one, the best way to understand how you can roadmap or how you can start to develop the product in a prudent fashion. But also not have the company just spend all of their money on these wasteful initiatives and essentially create this vicious cycle of the business feels burned from a money perspective because they were promised all of these things. They don't feel like they've actually gotten the value for it. So now they look to another person, another group, another vendor to help them unlock that value. And then they just sell them a false bill of goods over and over again. And then, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, they've bought 7 different solutions when somebody just stuck with one and roadmapped it the right way so that they have a sustainable product and have, to your point, beat out their competition over a longer perspective.
And I'll give you a good example of the why. So at Uber, we went really hard on real time. It was like, so I helped start the AI team at Uber. And then it was like, where do we use machine learning AI across the company? We had a big like emphasis on real time data. And it wasn't super obvious at first. It was like, why are we like developing new data systems that are like real time systems? Why, like, what's special about us compared to every other company that has not developed these systems yet? And the kind of like intuition there, it was part of the core business strategy to build like completely new experiences where transportation can be as reliable as running water. And so to do that, you needed to have a certain level of like economic activity in the industry, in the market, and a certain level of kind of personalization and everything. So all of that means is that the product fundamentally needed to be real time. When you request a ride, there's like so many things that are happening at the same time. How long is it going to take all these different cars to get to you? Okay, let's like evaluate them against one another. Let's do real time pricing. Let's do real time fraud detection. All these different things happen one after another, real time kind of like mapping where people should go. And that became a qualitatively different experience, like what Uber is today. It's a very different experience than the old kind of like, let me just kind of request a taxi and hope it gets here someday. You can even see the car's location in real time. And so that was a strategy to build like a kind of transcendentally different product experience through using data. And that's one of those kind of scenarios where the why it makes a lot of sense, because you're just going to get a completely different customer experience.
Well, and I think to build on that too, like something that you could have not necessarily be like 3 weeks late, but more of a laggard, is you don't need to have background checks on drivers come in real time immediately. You can have a 2 to 3 day lag on that. And so a business that's just like, let's do everything real time, is going to spend a bunch of money on that and focus on that, spinning their wheels, rather than focusing what at the heart of the customer is necessary, which is ensuring that that interactive experience of requesting a ride, seeing that it's 5 minutes away, seeing the 3 cars that are kind of jockeying for that ride around you, that seem as seamless as possible, as opposed to trying to have real time for everything within the app, which is just not feasible.
100%.
So the last question I have is, we've talked a lot about costs, and obviously as you go towards the streaming and real-time data, and us talking about it being not prudent or not smart to invest everything into real time, cost is the biggest component usually of that. And so aside from just prioritizing effectively or creating the right roadmap, what have been some ways, Mike, that you have seen the ability to develop the architectures, or maybe put guidelines or rules around the architectures to help ensure that cost isn't prohibitive in advancing these technologies?
Good question. So I think to kind of like frame the problem for folks, like everything is going to be real time and streaming in the future. So that's kind of like in the long term, everything's going there. In the short term, as you were saying, like the real answer is to just the first, like the highest order bit is to just be good at discriminating when you need fast data versus not fast data. And that's going to, even if the underlying infrastructure costs are not super prohibitive, the just kind of extra cost of having a team and have to debug that, it's like a harder thing to debug, and staff and stuff like that. It's just like a lot of stuff to do. So other than that though, if you can kind of get past that, eventually we need to go real time. But like, let's just be really good at choosing which use cases we want to be real time with today. And we've identified it, and now we want to figure out like what's the best way for us to use it. There's kind of 2 things that we see are quite common, and that we kind of like focus on actually in Tecton, and we build this into our platform actually. One is super simple. It's just caching. It's just like, even though you need real time, maybe you don't need real time for every single real time compute for every single data point you serve. And so you can use smart caching to really reduce the amount of online compute that you do, which is kind of like a built-in thing that we focus on, that we see that our customers really care about. They go, oh, that's awesome. That reduced, 90% of my online compute cost or something like that. So that's great. The second is having compute pipelines that are specialized to the type of transformations that you're doing. So you don't need to use like a general streaming compute processor for every single thing that you're doing that is fast. For example, at Tecton, one of the main types of features, or one of the main types of transforms uses for streaming data is for counts in aggregations on streaming data. This is just kind of what people use in AI, a lot of those. And we've got a lot of optimizations built in for specifically that type of streaming compute. And we have all this like automated compaction stuff that reduces the underlying infrastructure costs and increases the freshness and makes it faster to serve and all of that. But that's where you kind of like narrow in the use case, and our AI customers love it. Narrow in the use case, and then you can build a lot of use case specific optimizations. So that's a nice approach as well.
I love that. Well, I believe we are at time. I want to thank you both for meeting with me today and participating in the Open Source Data Summit. I believe your LinkedIn's or places to connect will be included as well in the show notes, as well as mine. With that, I'm Eric Gonzalez, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.